Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something truly remarkable. We're going to talk about the incredible, almost baffling human impulse to build something permanent in a world that felt anything but. We're going to delve into the lives of the medieval cathedral builders, these men of immense grit and ingenuity who dedicated their entire existence to erecting structures so vast, so ambitious, that not a single person who laid the first stone would ever live to see the last one placed. It's a story of faith, certainly, but it's also a story of muddy boots, political squabbles, and the kind of long-term project planning that makes our modern 5-year plans look like a hastily written grocery list. As always, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, a simple like or subscribe is always deeply appreciated. It lets me know that these quiet stories are finding a home, and I'm always curious to know where you're all listening from. It's a wonderful thought to know we have this little global community, all settling down for the night together, so feel free to leave a comment with your city or country. Now though, it's time to let all that go. Find that perfect spot in your bed, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes and let the noise of your day begin to fade. Just listen to the sound of my voice as we drift back, way back, to a time when the world was lit by fire, and the tallest things on the horizon were built for God. Chapter 1. The Grand Design, Piety, Power, and the Cathedral Boom. Let's begin not with a blueprint or a quarry, but with a feeling that permeated every aspect of medieval life, from the planting of crops to the birth of a child. It was a profound and ever-present sense of fragility. For the average person in the 11th or 12th century, the world was a deeply precarious place. Life was, to borrow a phrase, nasty, brutish and short. You worried about famine, which was always just one bad harvest away. You worried about disease, the mysterious pestilences that could sweep through a village and leave it a ghost town. You worried about random, casual violence, whether from a greedy lord, a passing mercenary, or just a disagreement that got out of hand. And above all, woven through everything, you worried about your immortal soul. The spiritual landscape was just as treacherous as the physical one. Hell wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal fiery destination, graphically depicted on the walls of the local church. Purgatory was a terrifying waiting room where your soul would be painfully scoured of its sins for centuries or millennia, unless you did something about it. God was not the gentle, benevolent figure we often imagine today. He was an all-powerful, all-seeing and often wrathful deity, the ultimate cosmic landlord who demanded his due. In this world, faith wasn't a lifestyle choice. It wasn't something you attended to for an hour on Sunday. It was the very operating system of reality. And if you believed, truly and deeply, that your entire existence, both here and in the unimaginably long hereafter, depends on the goodwill of this powerful being, what do? You do everything you can to get on his good side. You pray, you fast, you give alms, and if you're a town, a city, a whole community, you build him the biggest, most glorious, most awe-inspiring house you could possibly imagine. A cathedral wasn't just a building, it was a public works project, an insurance policy, and a desperate, beautiful prayer made of stone and glass, all rolled into one. It was a collective plea to the heavens. Please, look at what we've made for you. Please, spare us from the plague. Please, grant us a good harvest. And please, have mercy on our souls when our short, difficult time here is over. There was a sense, around the turn of the first millennium, that something was shifting. The year 1000 had come and gone without the apocalypse that many had nervously anticipated. Europe was slowly, clumsily, pulling itself out of the so-called Dark Ages. Trade routes were reopening. Populations were growing, and a new, fragile stability was beginning to take hold. A monk and chronicler of the time, Raoul Glaber, described it beautifully. He wrote that it was as if the world were shaking off its old age and clothing itself in a white robe of churches. This white robe wasn't just a poetic flourish. It was a literal description of what was happening, all across France, and then into England, Germany and Spain. New stone churches were rising from the earth. The old, dark, fire-prone wooden structures were being replaced by something new, something bigger, brighter, and infinitely more permanent. This was the dawn of the great cathedral boom, a construction craze that would last for centuries and reshape the skyline of Europe forever. But to think this was all just a pure, unadulterated outpouring of piety is to miss half the story, because wherever you find immense faith and vast sums of money, you will inevitably find politics, ambition, and good old-fashioned human rivalry. And the cathedral boom had all of these in spades. Let's start with the bishop. A medieval bishop was not just a spiritual leader, he was a major political player, a powerful feudal lord with vast lands, his own courts, and sometimes even his own army. His cathedral was his seat of power, his throne room, his administrative headquarters. A small crumbling cathedral was a sign of a small crumbling bishop. A magnificent soaring new cathedral, on the other hand, well, that sent a very different message. It was a statement of power and prestige, aimed not just at God, but at the local king, the rival duke, and especially the bishop in the next town over. The competition between cities was fierce, a kind of holy space race played out in limestone and stained glass. If the Bishop of Amiens announced he was building a new cathedral with a vault that reached 140 feet, you could be sure the Bishop of Beauvais would immediately start drawing up plans for one that would reach 150. It didn't matter if the engineering was untested, or the budget was pure fantasy. Pride was on the line. These cathedrals became the physical embodiment of civic identity. They were a town's Super Bowl trophy, its Eiffel Tower, and its moon landing all in one. Generations of citizens would live and die in the shadow of a building site, all contributing to a project whose primary motivation was, on some level, to show up the folks in the next valley. You think your new community sports complex is a big deal. Imagine dedicating your city's entire GDP for the next 150 years to building a church primarily to make the neighboring city feel inadequate. Of course, this kind of divine one-upmanship required money, staggering amounts of money, more money than any single bishop or even king could possibly have. So, how did they fund these colossal undertakings? This is where the medieval mind got truly creative. The fundraising apparatus for a great cathedral was a masterclass in marketing, theology, and financial engineering. The primary engine of this economy was something we now find quite alien: the cult of relics. Relics were the physical remains of saints or objects associated with them. A finger bone, a scrap of clothing, a splinter from the true cross. In a world without science, these objects were believed to be supercharged with divine power. They could heal the sick, protect a city from its enemies, and most importantly, reduce your time in that terrible waiting room of purgatory. A cathedral that housed a powerful relic was not just a church, it was a spiritual power plant. And it was also a massive tourist destination. The bishop and his canons, the clergy who ran the cathedral, understood this perfectly. Getting a top-tier relic was like a small town landing a Disney theme park today. It put you on the map. Pilgrims would flock from hundreds, even thousands of miles away, to be in the presence of the holy object. And pilgrims, then as now, didn't travel empty-handed. They needed places to stay, food to eat, and candles to buy. They left donations at the shrine, hoping for a miracle or a bit of divine favor. The cathedral became the heart of a vibrant local economy, all powered by, say, the reputed shinbone of a martyred saint. The competition for the best relics was, to put it politely, intense. Bishops dispatched agents across Europe and the Middle East on holy shopping sprees. Sometimes these relics were purchased for enormous sums. Other times they were acquired through less scrupulous means. The history of the period is filled with tales of pious thefts, where monks from one monastery would steal a saint's body from another, justifying it by claiming the saint had appeared to them in a dream and expressed a desire to be relocated. It was a strange and wonderful form of divine larceny. The relics would then be brought back to their new home in a grand procession, a massive marketing event designed to announce to the world that your cathedral now had the latest and greatest in holy artifacts. But even a blockbuster relic couldn't pay for everything, so the church deployed a whole range of other fundraising tools. One of the most effective was the selling of indulgences. An indulgence was, in essence, a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card. The church taught that great saints had built up a surplus of good deeds, a kind of treasury of merit in heaven. The Pope, and by extension his bishops, could draw upon this heavenly bank account and apply it to a sinner's spiritual debt. For a donation to the Cathedral Building Fund, you could buy an indulgence that would knock a specified number of years or even centuries off your sentence in purgatory. It was a brilliant system. It allowed the rich to essentially prepay their spiritual fines, and it gave the poor a tangible way to contribute to their salvation. Special preachers, masters of emotional rhetoric, would travel the countryside, holding what amounted to spiritual pledge drives. They would paint terrifying pictures of the torments of purgatory, and then, at the height of the emotional frenzy, offer the saving grace of an indulgence, available for a modest contribution to the glorious new Cathedral of St. Stephen or St. Mary. It was a holy Kickstarter campaign on a continental scale. Then there were the more conventional methods. The bishop could impose special taxes on all the goods sold in the diocesan market. Guilds of craftsmen, the weavers, the stonemasons, the bakers, would be pressured to donate funds to have their patron saint immortalized in a stained glass window. Wealthy nobles and merchants, nearing the end of their often sinful lives, would leave vast bequests to the cathedral in their wills, hoping to balance the celestial books at the last minute. Their family crest would be carved into a column capital, or set in a window, a permanent advertisement for their piety and their wealth. It was the original naming rights deal. The House of God was being sponsored by the House of Lancaster. All of this, the civic pride, the relic economy, the indulgences, the taxes, the bequests, created a river of gold, silver and copper flowing into the cathedral's coffers. It was this unprecedented concentration of capital that made the whole enterprise possible. But money is one thing. You still need people, thousands of them. Where did the workforce come from? In an overwhelmingly agrarian society, how do you persuade a vast army of men to put down their ploughs and pick up a chisel or a trowel for a project that will consume their entire working lives? The answer, like everything else, was a mix of the divine and the practical. For many, the call to work on a cathedral was a genuine act of piety. To labour on the house of God was seen as a form of prayer, a way to earn spiritual merit. The church encouraged this, of course. Bishops would often grant special indulgences just for the workers on the site. You weren't just earning a wage, you were actively paving your way to heaven. Every stone you lifted, every beam you hoisted, was a mark in your favour on Judgment Day. But let's be honest, piety doesn't put food on the table. The more powerful motivator for many was the promise of something incredibly rare in the medieval world: a steady job and a cash wage. A farmer's life was one of brutal uncertainty. His livelihood was at the mercy of the weather, the harvest, and the whims of his lord. The cathedral, by contrast, was the largest, most stable employer in the region. It offered regular pay, week in and week out, for decades on end. For a young man with a strong back and few prospects, signing on at the cathedral construction site was a life-altering career move. It was a chance to escape the endless, back-breaking cycle of farm labour. It was an opportunity to learn a skilled trade, to become a stone cutter, a carpenter, a glazier, and join a respected guild. This was a path to a different kind of life, one with more security and a higher social standing. So they came. They came from the surrounding villages and from faraway lands, drawn by the promise of work and salvation. The area around the rising cathedral would transform into a massive, bustling construction site, a city within a city. Temporary wooden lodges were built to house the craftsmen. Forges glowed day and night, sharpening tools and forging iron fittings. The air would be filled with a constant clamour, the rhythmic chip-chip-chip of hundreds of chisels on stone, the grating screech of cartwheels hauling massive blocks from the quarry, the shouts of the masters directing their crews, and the slow groaning creak of the huge wooden cranes lifting stones ever higher into the sky. This was the great paradox of the cathedral boom. It was born from a profound sense of the world's fragility and a deep fear of the afterlife. Yet it was fueled by the most worldly of motives: political ambition, civic rivalry, and hard-nosed economics. It was a spiritual endeavour that functioned like a massive corporation, with complex financing, a vast supply chain, and an enormous payroll. And so the decision was made. The bishop, having secured the backing of the town's elite, and perhaps a nod from the king, would preside over a grand ceremony. The site would be consecrated, blessed with holy water. The master mason, the architect and chief engineer of his day, would unroll his precious parchments, showing the designs that had been debated and refined for years. The first stone, the foundation stone, would be laid with all the pomp and circumstance the church could muster. No one present at that ceremony had any illusions that they would see the project completed. They knew they were starting something for their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren. Their reward was not in seeing the finished spire, but in the act of beginning. They were laying the foundation not just for a building, but for a legacy. They were starting a conversation with God that would be carried on by generations yet unborn. A conversation written in the universal language of stone, light, and soaring ambition. And in the morning, the real work would begin. The slow, arduous, dangerous work of turning a mountain of rock and a river of money into a miracle. Chapter 2. The Mason's Mark. Secrets and Hierarchy in the Builder's Lodge. That miracle, however, wasn't going to assemble itself. Faith and ambition could sketch the outline of a cathedral against the sky, and money could buy the mountain of stone, but turning that raw material into a reality that required a different kind of institution. It required a place that was less about prayer and more about practicality, less about divine inspiration and more about hard-won, jealously guarded knowledge. We're talking about the nerve center, the engine room, the operational headquarters of the entire colossal undertaking, a place known simply as the Mason's Lodge. From the outside, the lodge was nothing to look at, a long, low timber building, often thrown up hastily near the quarry, or right there in the shadow of the rising cathedral walls. It was rough, functional, and utterly devoid of the grace and beauty it was helping to create. It was a dusty shed next to a palace of God, but to underestimate the lodge would be like underestimating the humble, messy kitchen of a world-class restaurant. Inside this unassuming structure, the entire recipe for the cathedral was being written, tested, and executed. It was here that boys became men, men became craftsmen, and a few exceptional craftsmen became legends. It was a university, a union hall, a courtroom, and a fortress of secrets, all smelling faintly of wet stone, wood smoke, and sweat. Let's step inside, shall we? The air is thick with stone dust, a fine white powder that coats everything and gets in your lungs, a permanent souvenir of the trade. The light is dim, filtering through a few small high windows and perhaps an open door, supplemented by the flickering orange glow of a central fire pit or a crude hearth. The sounds are a constant, low-level symphony of industry. The rhythmic chink-chink-chink of mallets on chisels, the grating scrape of a saw on limestone, the gruff, low-spoken words of men who saved their energy for their work, and at the heart of it all, a rigid, unassailable hierarchy that governed every aspect of life. This was not a place of equals, it was a ladder, and the climb was long, hard, and started at the very bottom. At the base of this pyramid, so low he was practically part of the dirt floor, was the apprentice. Imagine a boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old. He's not here because he had a passionate, youthful dream of Gothic architecture. He's here because his father, a farmer or a minor craftsman, made a deal. He has signed a contract, an indenture, that essentially makes his son the property of a master mason for a period of typically 7 years. 7 years. Think about that. From the edge of childhood to the cusp of manhood, his life belongs to the lodge. In exchange, he gets a roof over his head. Most of the time, food in his belly, of a quality we might politely describe as functional. It was the medieval equivalent of a full scholarship to an Ivy League trade school, except your tuition was paid in grueling labour, and the campus was a permanent construction site. The first year, maybe 2, for our young apprentice, is a masterclass in humility. He is not learning to carve delicate tracery. He is learning the fine art of being invisible and useful at the same time. He is a gopher, a runner, a cleaner, a human Swiss Army knife for the senior masons. His day begins before sunrise, and it is a blur of menial tasks. He's sent to fetch water, to carry jugs of ale or cider for the men's midday break. He mixes mortar, his small hands raw from the lime, which had a nasty habit of eating away at your skin. He learns to sharpen tools, an endless, thankless task. A mason's chisel needed a perfect edge, and a single mistake could ruin the tool or the stone. So the boy would spend hours at the grinding wheel, learning the precise angle, the exact pressure, feeling the steel come to life under his hands. He is, in modern terms, the unpaid intern, but with a legally binding 7-year contract and absolutely zero chance of being asked for his creative input on a project. His education is not academic, it is purely based on absorption. There are no textbooks, no lectures. Most of the men in the lodge, even the masters, are likely illiterate. Knowledge is passed down through action, through observation, through the rhythm of the work. The boy learns the names of the tools, not from a chart on the wall, but by being yelled at to fetch the puncheon or the drag until the words are burned into his brain. He learns the different types of stone not from a geology lesson, but by the feel of them, the way they resist the chisel. He learns that limestone is soft and forgiving, that granite is stubborn and cruel, that sandstone will drink the water from your mortar if you're not careful. He learns by watching the journeymen, seeing how they hold their bodies, the angle of the strike, the subtle shift in weight that means the difference between a clean break and a shattered, useless block. And the discipline. It was robust. A lazy apprentice, or one who broke a valuable tool, could expect a swift and painful cuff to the ear or a thrashing with a switch. This wasn't a nurturing environment designed to foster self-esteem. It was a forge, designed to either shape a boy into a mason or break him. He slept in the lodge itself, or in a nearby hovel, often on a pile of straw, huddled with the other apprentices for warmth. He was cold, he was tired, he was perpetually sore, and he was always at the bottom of the food chain. If you've ever complained about your first job, just picture a 7-year stint where your primary key performance indicator is how quickly you can haul a bucket of sand without spilling it. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change occurs. After a few years of this relentless drudgery, the boy is no longer quite so useless. His muscles have hardened, his hands are calloused and strong. He can now anticipate what a mason needs before he asks for it. He can sharpen a set of tools to a razor's edge with his eyes half closed. He has absorbed the culture of the lodge, the quiet camaraderie, the gruff respect for skill, and so he is given his first real chance. He is given a soft, unwanted piece of stone and a simple, blunt chisel. His first task might be to learn how to make a flat surface, a process called dressing the stone. It sounds simple. It is maddeningly difficult. At first, his attempts are a disaster. He creates hills and valleys. He takes off too much. He chips the edges. But he persists, day after day, week after week. Under the critical eye of a journeyman, or the master himself, he learns. He learns to feel the stone through the tool, to read its grain, to listen to the sound of the strike, the sharp tink of a good cut, the dull thud of a clumsy one. He is finally being allowed into the very outer circle of the craft. He is learning the grammar of stone. As his apprenticeship draws to a close, after 7 long years, he must prove his worth. He is tasked with creating his masterpiece. This wasn't a masterpiece in the modern sense of a breathtaking work of art. It was a proof of competence. He might be asked to cut a perfect ashlar block, a cube of stone with perfectly square corners and flat faces, or perhaps a simple but precise section of moulding, or a basic voussoir, one of the wedge-shaped stones that forms an arch. He would work on it alone, in a corner of the lodge, all the skills he had absorbed over the years, funneled into this one piece of rock. The master mason would inspect it, turning it over and over, running his calloused thumb along the edges, checking the angles with his square. If it was deemed worthy, the boy's indenture was over. He was no longer an apprentice. He was now a journeyman. The word itself tells you everything you need to know. Journée, the French word for day. A journeyman was a man who was paid for a day's work, but it also implied a journey. Upon graduating, our young man was now free to leave the cathedral where he had grown up, free to travel, to seek work at other sites, to learn from other masters. This was a critical part of the system. It was how architectural styles, engineering tricks, and new techniques spread across Europe. A mason who had worked in Normandy might bring a new way of vaulting a ceiling to a project in England. A carver from Italy might introduce a more naturalistic style of sculpture to a lodge in Germany. These journeymen were the living, breathing internet of the medieval construction world, carrying valuable data packets of knowledge in their heads and their hands. When our newly minted journeyman arrived at a new construction site, a new city, he couldn't just walk up and ask for a job. He couldn't show them a resume or a portfolio. The world of the masons was a closed shop, a semi-secret society, intensely protective of its craft and its wages. So how did he prove he was the real deal, and not some farmer trying to bluff his way into a skilled, well-paying job? This is where the famous secrets of the masons come into play. These weren't, for the most part, mystical secrets about the nature of the universe. They were intensely practical. They were a medieval form of professional certification. The journeyman would be met by the master or a warden of the local lodge and challenged. He would be asked specific technical questions about geometry or stone cutting, questions only a trained mason would know, and he would be expected to know the right handshake, the right password, the right sign. These secret grips and words were a form of identification, a way of saying, "I am one of you, I have served my time, I know the craft." It ensured that standards were kept high and that wages weren't driven down by unskilled labour. It was a brilliant system of quality control and union protection, all wrapped in a cloak of mystery. Once accepted into the lodge, the journeyman's life was transformed. He was a respected craftsman, he was paid a good wage, he had a specialty. Perhaps he was a rough mason, one of the men who laid the foundation stones and built the rubble-filled core of the massive walls. Or maybe he was a freemason, not because he was free of any obligation, but because he worked with freestone, the high-quality limestone or sandstone that could be freely cut in any direction, used for the delicate visible work like window tracery, carvings and statues. These were the artists, the elite cutters. The lodge was now his professional and social home. Disputes between masons were settled here. Wages were set here. Support was offered here. If a man was injured, a constant, terrifying risk, the lodge might support him from its common funds. If he was killed, the lodge would ensure he had a proper burial and might even provide a small pension for his widow. It was a brotherhood, forged in shared danger, shared skill, and a fierce shared pride. They saw themselves as aristocrats of labour, set apart from the common herd by the mystery of their craft. And for decades, a man could live a good life as a journeyman, travelling, working, honing his skills, perhaps marrying and settling down. But for the most ambitious, the most talented, the most intelligent, there was one final step on the ladder, a step that took a man from being a master of stone to a master of men, plans, and physics. The ultimate prize, the title of Master Mason. The Master Mason of a great cathedral was one of the most powerful and respected figures in the medieval world. He was not just a foreman, he was the architect, the chief engineer, the project manager, and the CEO, all rolled into one. He was often the only person involved in the entire project who understood every single aspect of it, from the geology of the quarry to the geometry of the vaults to the logistics of feeding 1,000 workers. He no longer worked with a chisel. His tools were the compass, the square, and his mind. His canvas was not a single block of stone, but the entire cathedral, and his drawing board was one of the most fascinating places in the medieval world, the tracing floor. Somewhere within the lodge, or perhaps in a dedicated chamber, a large section of the floor would be coated with a smooth layer of plaster of Paris. This was the master mason's sacred space. Here, using a giant compass, long straight edges and charcoal, he would draw out the plans for the cathedral, not blueprints as we know them, small and symbolic, but full-scale, one-to-one drawings of complex elements, the exact curve of a rib vault, the intricate pattern of a rose window, the precise template for a buttress pinnacle. This was the heart of the secret knowledge. Journeymen would come to the tracing floor to make wooden templates from his drawings, which they would then take to the stone yard to guide their cuts. The knowledge on this floor was the lodge's most guarded intellectual property. At the end of the day, the drawings might be covered with a thin layer of sand or straw to be protected from prying eyes and the damp night air. The secrets the master mason possessed were, at their core, principles of practical geometry. They didn't have calculus or computer-aided design. Instead, they had a system of proportions derived from simple shapes, primarily the square and the equilateral triangle. This was the so-called sacred geometry. A principle like ad quadratum, or by the square, used the relationship between a square and its diagonal to generate all the key proportions of the building, from the width of the nave to the height of the aisles. It created a harmonious, unified, and most importantly, structurally stable design. These geometric tricks were not magic, they were brilliant, repeatable rules of thumb passed down from one generation of masters to the next. A body of knowledge refined over centuries of trial and no doubt catastrophic error. The master mason was a walking supercomputer of medieval engineering. He had to know how to calculate the thrust of an arch and design a buttress strong enough to counter it. He had to know how to build scaffolding hundreds of feet in the air, how to lift multi-ton blocks of stone with nothing but ropes, wooden cranes and manpower. He managed the quarries, negotiated contracts for timber and lead, hired and fired hundreds of men, from the most skilled carvers to the most humble diggers. He was constantly battling the constraints of his budget, the whims of his patron, be it a bishop or a king, and the unyielding laws of gravity. If you've ever felt stressed by a looming deadline at the office, imagine managing a 50-year project where a single miscalculation could bring 1,000 tons of stone crashing down, destroying decades of work and killing dozens of your men. And so we come to the mason's mark. Every journeyman, upon being accepted into a lodge, was assigned a personal symbol, his mark. After he finished dressing or carving a stone, he would chisel his mark into a hidden face of the block. It was a simple geometric design, uniquely his own. On one level, it was purely practical. It was a system of quality control and accounting. When the paymaster came around, he could see exactly who had cut which stones and how much they were owed. If a stone failed or was poorly cut, the master mason knew precisely who was responsible. But on a deeper level, the mason's mark was something more. In a world where most men were anonymous, their lives unrecorded, this mark was a signature. It was a quiet declaration of pride and identity. A single stone in a wall of tens of thousands, a tiny personal stamp on a project so vast it would outlive him, his children, and his children's children. It was a whisper across the centuries. I was here. I made this. My hands helped raise this house to God. As evening falls, the relentless noise of the site finally ceases. The men lay down their tools, their bodies aching. They gather in the lodge, not just for food and rest, but for community. The apprentices tend to the fire, the journeymen share stories of other sites, other cities, and the master mason pores over his drawings on the tracing floor, planning the next day, the next week, the next year of the impossible task ahead. The lodge, in the encroaching darkness, is a small island of order and purpose. It is a place where the chaos of a mountain of stone is transformed into the logic of an arch, where the ambition of a bishop is translated into the language of loads and stresses, and where a young boy, covered in dust and grime, can begin a journey that might one day make him the master of it all. The secrets of the lodge are safe for another night, held in the minds of its members and in the silent charcoal lines on the floor, waiting for the first light of dawn to once again begin the slow, methodical, and magnificent work of creating a miracle. Chapter 3. A Symphony of Suffering, the daily grind of pre-industrial construction. But that miracle, that slow and magnificent work, doesn't begin on the tracing floor. It doesn't begin with the master mason's charcoal or the bishop's grand ambition. No, the journey of a single perfect stone from the mind of God to its final resting place, nestled high in the vault of a cathedral, begins somewhere far less romantic. It begins miles away, in a dusty, sun-scorched scar in the earth, with the rhythmic, soul-crushing sound of iron striking stone. It begins in the quarry. Let's go there together. Forget the soaring spires for a moment. Picture instead a vast open pit, baking under the sun in summer, lashed by freezing rain in winter. The air here doesn't smell of incense and beeswax. It smells of sweat, iron, and something else. A fine, gritty powder that coats everything. Your tongue, your teeth, the inside of your lungs. This is the birthplace of the cathedral, and it is a place of brutal, relentless labour. The men who work here are not the revered master masons. They are the quarrymen, a rough and hardy lot, often at the very bottom of the construction hierarchy. Their job is deceptively simple: to persuade gigantic, multi-ton slabs of limestone or sandstone to part ways with the bedrock they've been fused to for millions of years. This persuasion, of course, is not done with gentle words. It's done with iron, wood, and raw human muscle. Imagine you are one of them. Your day starts before the sun has even thought about making an appearance. You're given a lump of coarse bread, maybe some weak ale, and you walk to the pit. Your tools are waiting for you, and they are laughably primitive by our standards. There's the pick, a heavy pointed hammer for chipping and shaping. There are long iron crowbars for leverage, and most importantly, there are the wedges, rows of iron and wooden wedges, the key to the whole operation. The first task is to find a promising section of rock, a place where the grain seems willing to cooperate. A master quarryman might tap along the rock face, listening for the right sound, a subtle change in tone that speaks of a clean break. Once a line is chosen, the real work begins. You and a partner take up your hammers and chisels, and you start to carve a groove into the stone, maybe a few inches deep, running the length of the block you hope to free. This is not quick work. It's hours of thud, 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 your shoulders and back screaming in protest, the vibrations jarring your bones. All the while, that fine, insidious dust is rising, a constant pale cloud you live and breathe in. No one has heard of silicosis. They just know that quarrymen tend to develop a deep, rattling cough as they get older. A cough that often carries them off long before their time. It's just part of the job, the price of the stone. Once the groove is cut, the wedges come into play. Iron wedges are hammered into the groove at intervals. You swing your sledgehammer in a steady rhythm with your partner. One miss, one glancing blow, and you could shatter his hand or your own. But you've been doing this since you were a boy. The rhythm is second nature. Clang, clang, clang. The iron wedges bite into the stone, applying immense pressure. The rock groans. You can feel the tension building under your feet. This is a dangerous moment. Sometimes the stone gives way unpredictably, sending shards flying like shrapnel. Men lose eyes this way. Then come the wooden wedges. These are soaked in water. You hammer them into the groove alongside the iron ones. And then you wait. You let nature do the work. As the wood absorbs the water, it swells with an incredible silent force. Over hours, or sometimes days, the pressure becomes too much for the ancient stone to bear. You might hear a deep crack, a sound that vibrates through the soles of your feet, and with a final shuddering groan, a block the size of a small carriage separates from the earth. There's a fleeting sense of triumph, but it doesn't last, because now you have a 20-ton rectangular problem sitting in the bottom of a pit. Getting it out is a whole other chapter in this book of suffering. It will be broken down into more manageable, yet still monstrously heavy pieces, using more wedges, more hammering, more sweat. Each block is roughly shaped or scabbled right here in the quarry. This is to remove any excess weight. No one wants to haul a single ounce of unnecessary stone for 50 miles. The masons on site need a roughly cubic block to work with, and that's what you give them. The ground is littered with chippings, the failures, the miscut pieces that represent weeks of wasted effort. You work from sun up to sundown. Your hands are a mess of calluses, cuts and blisters. In the summer, the sun beats down on the white stone, reflecting into your eyes until you're half blind with the glare. In the winter, the rain fills the pit, and you work in ankle-deep mud, the cold seeping into your bones. A slip on an icy rock could mean a broken leg, which is essentially a death sentence. There is no workers' compensation, no sick leave. If you can't work, you don't eat. The cathedral, in its majestic future form, is an abstraction. It's a story told by priests. Your reality is the weight of the hammer, the ache in your back, and the dust in your throat. And now, let's imagine our one hard-won block of stone is ready. It's been squared off, it's met the master's initial requirements, and it's been marked with the symbol of the quarry. Its journey is just beginning. Now comes the logistical nightmare. If you think getting a new sofa delivered is a headache, try orchestrating the movement of several hundred tons of rock across miles of medieval countryside. The first challenge is getting it out of the quarry itself. This is often done with immense wooden cranes, powered not by engines but by men. Picture a huge creaking timber structure. At its heart is a giant wheel, a tread wheel, perhaps 15 or 20 feet in diameter. And inside this wheel, men are walking endlessly, like hamsters in a cage, their combined weight and motion turning the axle that slowly, painstakingly, winds the ropes and lifts the stone. The foreman shouts commands. The ropes groan and stretch, seeming to thin under the incredible strain. Every man in the pit holds his breath. A snapping rope doesn't just mean losing the stone. It means a multi-ton block plummeting back into the pit, and it doesn't care who is underneath. Once it's on level ground, the next stage of its grand tour begins. It's loaded onto a cart, but this isn't just any cart. This is a massive, purpose-built wagon with a solid wooden axle as thick as a man's chest and 4 enormous iron-rimmed wooden wheels. The cart itself might weigh a ton or more, and the motive power, not a diesel engine, not even a steam engine. A team of oxen, 8, 10, sometimes 12 huge placid beasts, yoked together, their breath misting in the cold air. The oxen are the unsung heroes of cathedral construction. They are slow, they are stubborn, but they are immensely powerful. They strain against their yokes, hooves digging into the dirt, and the great wagon begins to move with the speed of a dying snail. And where is it going? Not down a paved 6-lane highway. It's going down what medieval people politely called a road. In reality, it's a muddy, deeply rutted track, a quagmire in the rain, and a dust bowl in the heat. A team of men, the carters, walks with the wagon. Their job is a constant, exhausting battle against physics and terrain. They carry long levers to heave the wheels out of muddy ditches. They shout encouragement, or perhaps more colourful things, at the oxen. They watch the load, praying it doesn't shift. A journey of 20 miles might take a week. At night, they sleep under the wagon, guarding their precious cargo, because this single block of stone represents a huge investment of time and money. Losing it would be a disaster. The road is the enemy. Every rut, every stream, every steep incline is a potential crisis. Imagine the sheer, heart-stopping terror of guiding that immense weight down a slippery hill. There are no disc brakes. There are men with ropes, straining to keep the cart from running away and crushing the entire team of oxen before it. There are logs dragged behind as a crude anchor. It's a controlled catastrophe waiting to happen. If the cathedral site is near a river, the builders thank God, because water transport is infinitely more efficient. The stone is hauled to a dock, loaded onto a sturdy barge, and floated downstream. This is faster, smoother, and you can move far more weight. But it's not without its own perils. Rivers flood, barges can run aground on sandbars, a sudden storm can whip up the water and threaten to capsize the whole enterprise, sending a season's worth of immaculately quarried stone to the riverbed, lost forever. The journey is slow, methodical, and fraught with constant low-grade anxiety. And all of this entire Herculean effort, is for one single stone. Now multiply that by tens of thousands. The entire landscape for a 50-mile radius around a new cathedral becomes a slow-moving network of dusty roads and laden barges, a vast circulatory system of stone, timber and lead, all pulsing towards a single point on the map. Every single piece of that magnificent building has made this same arduous journey. Every block in the wall, every carved saint, every slender column began its life in a violent act of separation from the earth, and endured a long, perilous pilgrimage before it could even begin to be part of something beautiful. So now, let's assume our stone has survived. It has been heaved out of the earth, it has endured the muddy roads and the moody rivers, and it has finally arrived at the bustling, chaotic and profoundly dangerous place that is the construction site. It is lowered from its cart, and it now sits in a vast, sprawling yard next to the rising skeleton of the cathedral. It's here that it joins a mountain of other raw materials, piles of sand and lime for mortar, forests of timber waiting to become scaffolding, forges glowing day and night, where blacksmiths are sharpening tools, forging hinges, making nails by the thousand. The entire area is a hive of activity, a symphony of noise, the clang of hammers on iron, the chipping of chisels on stone, the shouting of foremen, the creak of ropes, the lowing of oxen. It smells of sawdust, coal smoke, and unwashed humanity. Our stone is now in the hands of the masons, but not the masters, not yet. First it goes to the lesser skilled workers, the rough masons or layers. These are the men who build the core of the walls, the rubble-filled interior that the beautifully cut stones will eventually cover. Their work is less glamorous but just as vital, and what holds it all together? Mortar. Making medieval mortar is not a matter of opening a bag of premix from the local hardware store. It's a filthy, labor-intensive process. You need lime, which is made by burning limestone or chalk, or even seashells in a kiln for days on end. It's a hot, smoky, choking job. Then that lime is slaked with water, a volatile process that produces clouds of steam and intense heat. This lime putty is then mixed with sand and water, usually in a large pit. And who does the mixing? Often it's the lowest of the labourers, sometimes young boys, who get into the pit with long wooden hoes and literally tread the mixture with their bare feet, churning it for hours until it reaches the right consistency. It was caustic, miserable work. The lime would burn their skin, leaving sores and rashes. While this is happening, another army of labourers is engaged in perhaps the most terrifying job of all, building the scaffolding. Look at any drawing of a medieval construction site. You will not see clean modular steel scaffolding with safety rails and hard hats. You will see a tangled, almost organic-looking web of wooden poles and platforms lashed together with rope. It looks like a giant, precarious bird's nest clinging to the side of the stone walls. The men who built this were called scaffolders, or carpenters of the forest. They were fearless, agile, and probably a little insane. They would scale the rising walls, carrying heavy timber poles on their shoulders. They would stand on a narrow, half-finished wall, hundreds of feet in the air, with the wind trying to tear them from their perch and lash the next upright into place. The platforms they worked on were often just a few rough planks laid across the poles. A misstep, a sudden gust of wind, a rotten piece of rope. That was it. The ground was a long, long way down. Historians examining the skeletons of medieval labourers often find evidence of multiple healed fractures. These were the lucky ones. Many did not survive their first fall, and so the walls rise. Our stone, having been roughly shaped in the quarry, is now ready for the bankersons, the highly skilled masons who will give it its final perfect form. They work in covered lodges on the ground, each man at his own banker or workbench. Here the stone is transformed. Using a variety of mallets, chisels and templates, the mason cuts the block with astonishing precision. This is a slow, patient art. One wrong move, one careless tap of the mallet, and a week's work could be ruined, the stone fractured beyond repair. He is not just cutting a block, he is shaping a component of a complex, interlocking three-dimensional puzzle. This stone has to fit perfectly with its neighbours, bearing and distributing the immense loads that will be placed upon it. He uses a set square and a compass, checking every angle, every surface, ensuring it is perfectly true. The soft tap, tap, tap of the chisel is a counterpoint to the rougher noises of the yard. But even this skilled work carried its own hidden danger. The fine dust from the stone, the same dust that plagued the quarrymen, was inescapable here too. Breathing it in day after day, year after year, led to the mason's curse, that same deadly lung disease. They were creating objects of sublime, eternal beauty, and the very process was slowly, silently killing them from the inside. Finally, our stone is ready. It's perfect. It has been quarried, shaped, transported, and finished. Now it just needs to be lifted 200 feet into the air and set in place. This is where we encounter one of the most ingenious and terrifying pieces of medieval technology, the Great Wheel, or treadwheel crane. We saw a smaller version in the quarry, but the one on the cathedral site is a monster. It's a huge wooden crane, a long swinging arm, perched precariously on the highest point of the construction. Powering it is that same hamster wheel design, but this one is large enough for 2 or even 4 men to walk inside. These men were known as winders or wheel walkers. They would step inside the great wheel and simply start walking. Their combined weight and forward motion would turn the giant drum, which would slowly wind the thick hemp rope and lift the payload. Imagine the scene. A half-ton block of exquisitely carved stone is attached to the rope. The foreman gives the signal. Inside the dark, cavernous wheel, the men begin to trudge. The wheel creaks and groans. The rope, thick as a man's arm, tightens, vibrating like a giant harp string. The stone lifts from the ground. It sways gently in the breeze. Higher and higher it goes, past the first level of scaffolding, past the second. The men in the wheel can't see the stone. They can't see the ground. They are walking in the dark, guided only by the foreman's shouts. Their pace has to be perfect. If they walk too fast, the load could swing out of control. If they slow down or stop, the weight of the stone could reverse the wheel, sending them tumbling backwards inside the drum, likely breaking their legs or their necks. There is no brake. The only thing holding that half-ton of rock suspended in mid-air is the steady, synchronized pace of the men walking inside a wooden wheel. And high above, on a rickety wooden platform, another team of masons waits. They are the setters, the elite. They are the ones who guide the stone into its final resting place. The wind is a constant menace up here. It plucks at your clothes. It tries to steal your tools. It whispers lies in your ear about how easy it would be to just lean a little too far. You have no safety harness. You have no hard hat. You have your skill, your balance, and a profound hope that the men in the wheel are paying attention and the rope makers did their job well. The stone arrives, swinging ponderously. You and your team have to grab it, muscles straining, and guide it into position. Using crowbars for fine adjustments, you nudge it left, then right. The foreman shouts instructions. Mortar is quickly slapped onto the bed. And then, with a final gentle thump, the stone settles into place. It is home. Its long journey is over. There is a moment of quiet satisfaction. Then the hook is released. The foreman yells, and the whole terrifying process begins again with the next stone, and the next, for days and weeks and years on end. This daily grind was the reality for generations of builders. A single cathedral, like Notre Dame in Paris or Lincoln in England, could take over 100 years to complete. A man might start his life as a boy mixing mortar, spend his middle age as a mason cutting stone, and die of old age or lung disease, having only ever worked on this one single project, a project he would never see completed. His son, and perhaps his grandson, would take his place. What was life like outside of the work itself? It was basic, to put it mildly. The builders often lived in temporary lodges or huts erected around the site. These were simple wooden structures, crowded and smoky. They slept on straw pallets, which they shared with fleas and lice. The sanitation was what you might expect. A ditch somewhere downwind. Disease could sweep through the camp with terrifying speed. A simple infection from a cut could be a death sentence. Their diet was monotonous and meager. The building accounts that survive give us a good idea of what they ate. It was mostly bread and cheese, washed down with huge quantities of weak beer or ale, which was often safer to drink than the local water. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps on a feast day. This was fuel for labour, nothing more, and they needed it. It's estimated that a labourer doing this kind of heavy work would burn upwards of 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day. And yet, it wasn't all misery. The construction site was a community. The men worked together, they drank together, they shared a common purpose. The skilled masons, in particular, were part of a proud and secretive fraternity. They had their own customs, their own signs of recognition. They were itinerant workers, moving from one great project to the next, their skills highly in demand across Europe. A master mason was a respected figure, a combination of architect, engineer, and project manager. He might not live in a palace, but he was a world away from the poor soul treading mortar in a pit. But for every master mason, there were 100 anonymous labourers, men who dug the foundations, who carried the hods of mortar up endless ladders, who walked in the great wheel, who hammered wedges in the quarry. Their names are not recorded. Their faces are not carved among the saints on the cathedral facade. Their contribution is the anonymous sweat and blood that holds the stones together. They are the silent, invisible chorus in this great symphony of suffering. Think about the sheer physical and mental fortitude it required to wake up every day, knowing your work was not only crushingly hard, but also fraught with the constant possibility of sudden violent death or slow lingering illness. There was no concept of a weekend as we know it. You worked 6 days a week from sunrise to sunset. Your only time off was Sunday and a handful of religious holidays. There was no retirement plan waiting for you. You worked until your body gave out. And for what? For a wage that was barely enough to feed your family. And for the abstract promise of contributing to a monument for the glory of God. We look at these buildings today, and we are rightly awed. We see the delicate tracery of the windows, the soaring grace of the vaults, the serene expressions on the faces of the stone angels. We see divinity, art, and genius, and all of that is true. But what we don't see is the human cost. We don't see the man who fell from the scaffolding building the North Tower. We don't hear the ghost of a cough from the quarryman whose lungs were turned to stone. We don't feel the permanent ache in the back of the labourer who carried 1,000 tons of mortar in his lifetime. The cathedrals are not just monuments to faith. They are monuments to human endurance. They are silent testaments to the incredible resilience and forgotten suffering of the thousands of men who built them. Every stone is a story of a journey. Every joint is sealed with mortar mixed by tired feet. And every foot of height was gained by men risking their lives on a spiderweb of wood and rope. So the next time you find yourself standing in one of these magnificent spaces, let your eyes drift up the pillars, follow the lines of the vaulting ribs as they meet in the heavens. But for a moment, think not of the heavens but of the earth. Think of the pit in the ground, miles away. Think of the men with hammers and wedges, of the slow, groaning oxer, of the men walking to nowhere inside a giant wooden wheel. Because the path to that divine, light-filled space was paved with grit and sweat and an astonishing amount of very, very hard work. It was a slow, methodical, and magnificent miracle. Yes, but it was a miracle built on a foundation of human pain. And as the light filters through the stained glass, casting colours on the ancient floor, it's worth remembering the shadows too. The long, deep shadows of the men who gave their lives, in ways both sudden and slow, to raise these mountains of stone. Chapter 4. Bread and Mortar. Life and Community at the Foot of the Giants. But shadows, of course, have to be cast by something. They are attached to people, and when the sun finally set on another grueling day, when the last block was hoisted and the last chisel fell silent, these men of stone and shadow had to step down from the scaffolding and return to a life on the ground. A life that was, in its own way, just as complex and just as fraught with peril as the one they lived 100 feet in the air. Because building a cathedral wasn't just a construction project, it was an invasion. Imagine your quiet, respectable market town, a place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where the biggest news of the week is a dispute over the price of wool. And then one day, a small army descends. Not an army with swords and banners, but an army with mallets and saws. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, arriving from all corners of the country, and even from across the channel. They are loud, they are foreign, and they are here to stay for the next century or two. This itinerant workforce was a strange and complicated beast for any town to digest. On one hand, it was an undeniable economic stimulus package. The local brewers suddenly found themselves with a perpetually thirsty clientele. The bakers couldn't turn out loaves of coarse, dark bread fast enough. The butchers, the tanners, the candle makers, everyone with something to sell found a new, eager market. The project was a massive injection of cash and commerce into a local economy, and the town council, while perhaps wringing its hands in private, could certainly appreciate the sudden influx of coin. The local tavern keeper, who previously served a few farmers on market day, now had a packed house every single night, full of men with a few precious pennies and a powerful desire to forget the aches and fears of their day. But on the other hand, these men were outsiders. They spoke with strange accents, had different customs, and possessed a rough, transient quality that made the settled townsfolk deeply uneasy. They were seen as rootless, unbound by the local ties of family and parish that governed medieval life. A surge in population meant a surge in everything else: noise, drunkenness, brawls in the street, and a general strain on the town's resources. The local watch, likely consisting of a few volunteers with rusty polearms, was suddenly tasked with policing a rowdy, predominantly male community with little to lose. So you have this fascinating dynamic: a town living in a state of perpetual low-grade friction with the very engine of its prosperity. The builders were both a blessing and a curse. The townsfolk needed their wages, but distrusted their ways, and the builders, in turn, likely viewed the locals with a mixture of dependence and contempt. They needed the town for bread and ale, but probably saw the townspeople as soft, parochial, and ignorant of the grand, dangerous work they were engaged in just beyond the town walls. It was a relationship of symbiotic suspicion, and at the heart of that relationship, as with so many things, was money. What did a cathedral builder actually earn? Well, it depended entirely on who you were. The world of the worksite was as rigidly hierarchical as the church itself. At the very top you had the master mason, the architect, the project manager. He was a man of considerable status and wealth, often literate, who might earn as much as a shilling a day, a truly princely sum. He would have his own private lodgings, perhaps even a small house rented in town, and his family would likely be with him. He was a professional, respected, and well compensated, but as you moved down the ladder, the picture changed dramatically. A skilled journeyman stonemason, a carver, a setter, might earn around 4 or 5 pence a day. It was a good wage, a living wage, one that put him comfortably in the upper tier of the working class. But below him were the ranks of the less skilled, the rough masons, the carpenters, the plasterers, earning maybe 3 pence a day. And at the very bottom of this pyramid were the labourers, the men who did the brute, back-breaking work, digging foundations, turning the great wheels, mixing mortar, carrying hods of stone and sand up endless flights of rickety scaffolding. These men were lucky to earn a penny and a half, maybe 2 pence a day. It was enough to survive on, but not much more. And these wages were rarely consistent. Payment could be delayed for weeks if the project's funds ran low. A war, a bad harvest, a change in the local bishop. Any number of things could choke off the flow of money, leaving the entire workforce in a state of limbo. A week of bad weather, when no work could be done, often meant a week of no pay. There was no safety net, no unemployment insurance. If the work stopped, the income stopped. This constant financial precarity was a source of deep, gnawing anxiety that hung over the entire community. So what could you actually buy with your 3 peasants? Let's go on a little shopping trip. A gallon of cheap ale. The weak, watery stuff that was more about hydration than intoxication might cost you a halfpenny. A loaf of bread, the staple of your diet, would be about the same. For a full penny, you could get a hot meal of pottage, a thick soupy stew of grains and whatever vegetables were on hand from a cook shop. A pound of cheese was a luxury, costing a penny or more. Meat was a rare treat, something for a feast day. A whole chicken could cost a penny, a significant chunk of a labourer's daily earnings. So for his day's wage, a labourer could buy bread, ale, and perhaps a bit of cheese with nothing left over. A skilled mason, however, could afford better food, better drink, and perhaps even save a tiny amount. The economic gap between the man carving a gargoyle and the man hauling the stone for it was immense. And where did these men lay their heads at night, after a day of toil and a meager supper? The phrase housing crisis doesn't quite do it justice. For the skilled craftsman there was the lodge, the loggia. This was more than just a place to sleep. It was a combination workshop, dormitory, and union hall. It was a long timber-framed building erected right on the construction site. During the day, it was a space for finer work, carving delicate tracery, planning out templates on the floor. At night, it transformed. The tools would be put away, and the space would become a communal sleeping area. Imagine a long, smoky hall, the air thick with the smell of sawdust, sweat, and damp wool. A central fire pit does its best to beat back the chill, but mostly just fills the room with haze. Along the walls are simple wooden bunks, or more likely just raised platforms covered in a deep layer of straw or bracken. This was your bed. Your mattress was a sack filled with more straw. Your pillow a log or a rolled-up cloak. You'd be sharing this space with dozens of other men. There was no privacy. The sounds were a constant symphony of snoring, coughing, and the mutterings of men in their sleep. In the winter, you'd huddle together for warmth, the press of unwashed bodies, a small comfort against the drafts that whistled through the timber walls. These lodges fostered a powerful sense of camaraderie and identity. It was here, around the fire, that skills were passed down, grievances were aired, and the secretive rituals and handshakes of the masons' guilds were born. It was a brotherhood forged in stone dust and shared hardship. But for the unskilled labourers, even the rough comfort of the lodge was a luxury. They were housed in what can only be described as a shanty town, a chaotic collection of makeshift huts and hovels that sprang up in the shadow of the rising cathedral. These were what we would politely call self-built homes. Think wattle and daub, a framework of woven sticks, smeared with a delightful mixture of mud, clay, and animal dung, with a roof of thatch or turf. They were small, dark, and damp. The floor was just beaten earth, which would turn to a muddy soup in the rain. A fire in the centre of the room provided the only heat and light. the smoke finding its way out through a simple hole in the roof, or more often, just filling the space until your eyes watered. These shanties would be crowded with men, sometimes entire families who had followed the work. The sanitary conditions were, to put it mildly, non-existent. Waste was simply thrown into the street, creating a foul-smelling morass. Disease was rampant, a simple infection, something we would treat with a 5-day course of antibiotics, could be a death sentence. Life in the shadow of God's house was often short, brutal, and smelly. You can imagine the stark contrast. By day, these men were building a soaring, light-filled monument to divine perfection. By night, they returned to a world of mud, smoke, and squalor. It's a paradox that sits at the very heart of their existence. So, how did they cope? What fueled this incredible human engine? The answer, in large part, was bread and ale. The diet was incredibly monotonous. The cornerstone of every meal was bread, not the light, fluffy loaf you might buy today, but dense, heavy, dark bread made from rye or barley. It was calories. It was fuel. This would be supplemented by pottage, that eternal medieval stew. It was the ultimate use-what-you've-got dish. A pot would be simmering over a fire all day, and into it would go oats, barley, peas, beans, and whatever scraps of vegetables could be found. Onions, leeks, cabbage. It was warm, it was filling, and it was cheap. And then there was the ale. It's impossible to overstate the importance of ale in the medieval world. It wasn't just a recreational beverage. It was a fundamental part of life. Firstly, it was safer than water. Rivers and wells were often contaminated, and the brewing process, which involved boiling the water, killed off most of the harmful bacteria. So drinking ale was just a sensible public health measure. Secondly, it was a major source of calories. The small beer or weak ale that was drunk throughout the day was thick, soupy, and full of carbohydrates from the grain. It was liquid bread, providing the energy needed for a day of hard labour. It was common for a worker's contract to include a daily allowance of ale, often a gallon or more. This wasn't a sign of rampant alcoholism. It was a practical necessity. Of course, after work, stronger ale was consumed for more traditional reasons. The alehouse was the community's living room. It was the one place that was warm, relatively bright, and offered an escape from the cramped, miserable living quarters. It was here that news was exchanged, songs were sung, and friendships were forged over cheap wooden cups. It was a place of fleeting joy and loud camaraderie, a necessary release valve for the pressures of their lives. Here, for a few hours, a man was not just a labourer or a mason. He was part of a boisterous, temporary family, united by their shared thirst and shared experience. Life wasn't all work and sleep. However, the medieval calendar was punctuated by a surprising number of holy days and feast days. These were the equivalent of our public holidays, and they were taken very seriously. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the various saints' days provided much-needed breaks from the relentless grind. These were days of feasting, drinking, and games. Simple pleasures were the norm. Wrestling, archery contests, a rough-and-tumble version of football that was more like a controlled riot. There was gambling with dice, storytelling, and music from a passing minstrel. These festivals were explosions of colour and noise in an otherwise grey existence, moments when the community could forget the dangers of the worksite and the dampness of their huts, and simply be human. And what of their inner lives? What did a man who spent his days shaping stone for the house of God actually believe? Their faith was not the sterile, intellectual theology of the bishops and scholars who commissioned the cathedrals. It was a much earthier, more practical, and more superstitious affair. They were building a sacred space, and their lives were steeped in a casual, everyday piety. Prayers were muttered before starting a dangerous task. The local saint was seen as a personal protector and patron, but this orthodox belief was woven together with a thick thread of folk superstition. The world was a place full of unseen forces, both good and evil, and you needed all the help you could get. They saw omens in the flight of a bird. They carried charms and amulets to ward off the evil eye, or to protect them from falling. A skilled carver, while meticulously shaping the image of a saint, might also carve a grotesque, leering face, a gargoyle, or a chimera, not just as a decorative flourish or a waterspout, but as a magical protector, a fierce guardian to scare away demons from the sacred walls he was building. Their worldview was a fascinating blend of the sacred and the profane. They worked on a divine project, yet their lives were deeply, profoundly worldly. They understood the engineering of a flying buttress, but they also believed that a certain incantation could keep a rope from snapping. They were surrounded by the physical manifestation of Christian doctrine, yet their daily fears were of hunger, injury, and the malevolent spirits they believed lurked in the dark woods beyond the town. This wasn't a contradiction to them. It was simply the way the world worked. You needed prayer, yes, but you also needed a lucky charm. You needed faith in God, but it didn't hurt to have a gargoyle watching your back. And so we see a picture of a community living in a temporary, precarious, and utterly vital world. They were a tribe of builders, suspended between the heavens they were creating and the muddy earth they lived on. They were masters of geometry and engineering, yet subject to the whims of weather and the frailties of the human body. They were outsiders to the towns they transformed, creating permanent monuments of breathtaking beauty, while their own lives were as transient as a traveller's footprint in the mud. They built homes for God, lined with gold and glass, while they themselves slept on straw in smoky, crowded hovels. Their legacy is written in stone, soaring towards the sky in every city in Europe, but their lives, their struggles, their small joys and deep anxieties were written in the more fleeting materials of bread and mortar and the shared warmth of an alehouse fire on a cold night. They were the forgotten foundation, the human scaffolding upon which these great dreams of faith were built, and as we leave them to their meager meal and their rough camaraderie, another day done, it's clear that the story of the cathedral is not just one of stone, but of the flesh and blood that gave that stone its shape and its soul. Chapter 5. Echoes in Stone. Generations of anonymous immortality. Their small joys and deep anxieties were written in the more fleeting materials of bread and mortar, and the shared warmth of an alehouse fire on a cold night. They were the forgotten foundation, the human scaffolding upon which these great dreams of faith were built. And as we leave them to their meager meal and their rough camaraderie, another day done, it's clear that the story of the cathedral is not just one of stone, but of the flesh and blood that gave that stone its shape and its soul. But that flesh and blood was, by its very nature, temporary. The hands that laid the first course of stones on the foundation of Chartres or Canterbury would be dust long, long before the final spire was capped. The soul that envisioned the glorious rose window would have departed this world generations before a single shard of its coloured glass was set in place. And this, right here, is perhaps the most profound and alien concept for us to wrap our modern minds around. We live in a world of instant downloads, of same-day delivery, of quarterly reports and 2-week sprints. We get anxious if a web page takes more than 3 seconds to load. Our sense of a long-term project is saving up for a down payment on a house, a goal that spans maybe 5 or 10 years. The men and women of the great cathedral age operated on a completely different timeline. Theirs was a covenant with the unborn. They were engaged in an act of such audacious, magnificent, and frankly quite mad, long-term planning, that it borders on the unbelievable. To be a cathedral builder was to dedicate your entire working life, your one and only life, to a single chapter in a book you would never ever get to read to the end. You were writing the first act of a play, knowing full well you would be long gone before the curtain fell. Imagine the first master mason. Let's call him Jean. He's a man of immense skill, a geometric genius, the 12th century equivalent of a star architect and a lead structural engineer rolled into one. He stands on a muddy field, perhaps with the bishop and a few wealthy patrons, and he points at the sky. There, he says, with a confidence that is almost divine, will be the bell tower, and there the great west facade. In his mind he sees it. He sees the soaring vaults, the light streaming through the clerestory windows. He has calculated the thrusts and counter-thrusts, the delicate balance of forces that will allow tons of stone to float gracefully towards heaven. He spends years on the plans, not on a computer with CAD software that can render a 3D model in seconds, but on precious, expensive sheets of vellum or parchment. He draws with charcoal and ink, using a compass and a straight edge. These aren't just blueprints, they are a kind of sacred text. They are the gospel of the building. He might oversee the digging of the foundations, a vast trench filled with rubble and lime, a footprint for a giant. He might live long enough to see the first few courses of the ambulatory walls rise from the ground, perhaps to the height of a man, and that's it. He might live a good long life for his era, making it to his 50s or even 60s. And on his deathbed, surrounded by his apprentices and his sons, the great work he envisioned would be, to our eyes, little more than a glorified construction site, a stump, a promise. What kind of mind does it take to accept this? To pour your entire creative and intellectual energy into a project with a completion date scheduled for, say, the year 1450, when you're standing there in 1220, it requires a profound psychological leap, a recalibration of what achievement and legacy even mean. His legacy wasn't the finished building, it was the integrity of the plan. It was the successful transfer of knowledge to the next generation. His immortality wasn't having his name carved above the door. It was knowing that the foundational mathematics were sound, that the vision was so clear and so powerful that it could survive him. He was planting a redwood sapling, knowing that the only thing he would ever experience of it was the fragile green shoot, while entrusting the full, magnificent tree to the care of his great-great-great-grandchildren. This concept of time was woven into the very fabric of medieval life. Time for them wasn't the frantic linear race that it is for us. It was cyclical. The day was governed by the ringing of monastery bells for the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce. The year was governed by the slow, predictable turn of the agricultural seasons, ploughing, planting, growing, harvesting, and spiritual life was governed by the liturgical calendar, another great wheel that turned through Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and back again. Life was a rhythm, a repetition, and beyond this earthly rhythm was the vast, unchanging expanse of eternity with God. Seen through that lens, 100 years isn't an impossibly long time. It's just a few turns of the wheel. Building a house for God wasn't a project to be rushed. It was a form of worship in itself, an act of patience and devotion. The slow, methodical, generation-spanning process of construction was a mirror of God's own patient, eternal work. Rushing it would have been seen as unseemly, even blasphemous. You gave God your best work, and you gave him your time, all of it, your entire life if that's what it took, and you trusted that he saw the whole picture, even if you only ever saw one tiny corner of the canvas. So how was this grand vision preserved? How did the plan, the architectural DNA of the cathedral, survive the death of its creator? It was a fragile and complex process, a mixture of written documents, oral tradition, and pure institutional memory. John, our first master mason, would have had his precious drawings. These might include a ground plan, an elevation of the main bays, and detailed drawings of key elements like window tracery or pillar cross-sections. These plans were often drawn not on small sheets, but life-sized, on a massive, specially prepared plaster floor known as a tracing floor. In the lofts or a side chapel of the cathedral in progress, the master and his apprentices would walk across the building's future, literally stepping on the lines that would become stone realities. It was a physical, immersive blueprint you could inhabit. But these drawings were not enough. They couldn't capture every nuance, every trick of the trade. They couldn't explain the feel of a certain type of stone, or the precise consistency of mortar needed on a damp Tuesday in November. That knowledge lived in the minds and hands of the masons themselves. It was passed down not through text, but through a long, slow apprenticeship. A young boy, maybe 12 or 13, would be entrusted to a master. He would start with the grunt work, mixing mortar, carrying tools, sweeping the lodge. He would watch, he would listen. For years he would just absorb the rhythms, the sounds, the smells of the site. He would learn to read a block of stone, to see the hidden fault lines, to understand its grain. He would learn the secret language of the masons, the geometry that was seen as a divine art, a way of understanding the mind of God, the great architect of the universe. This knowledge was often jealously guarded. The masons' lodge, the wooden shed on the construction site where they took their meals, stored their tools, and planned their work, was more than just a break room. It was a school, a guild hall, a secret society. Here the senior masons would instruct the juniors, passing on the mysteries of the craft. They developed hand signs and passwords, not for some grand conspiracy, but for a very practical reason: to identify a properly trained, skilled mason from another town, to ensure that the man you were hiring to help you build a vault that would support hundreds of tons of stone actually knew what he was doing. It was the medieval version of a professional certification. When our first master mason, John, grew old, he would have spent his final years ensuring his chosen successor, perhaps his own son, or his most gifted apprentice, knew not just how to read the plans, but how to understand the intent behind them. He would walk him through the half-built structure, tapping a pillar here, pointing to a buttress there, explaining why it was designed that way. The wind on this hill comes from the west, he might say, so we must make these supports thicker. The limestone from the north quarry is softer. Use it for the detailed carving, not for the load-bearing columns. It was a living knowledge, a conversation between generations, and when Jean died, the new master mason, let's call him Pierre, would take the vellum scrolls, unroll them on the tracing floor, and continue the work. But Pierre was not John. He was a man of his own time. Perhaps a new technique had been developed in a neighbouring region, a more efficient way to cut stone, a more elegant design for a ribbed vault. While respecting the foundational vision of his predecessor, Pierre might introduce subtle changes. This is why a cathedral is a living document of architectural history. You can walk through a great church and see the centuries layered on top of each other. The heavy, sombre, round arches of the early Romanesque choir might give way to the soaring, pointed arches and slender columns of the high Gothic nave, built 50 years later. The simple geometric stained glass of the 12th century might sit yards away from the flamboyant, flame-like tracery and intricate pictorial glass of the 15th. The building evolved, it breathed with the times. The patrons' desires changed. A new wealthy guild might donate money for a side chapel dedicated to their patron saint, and it would be built in the style of that day, not the style of a century before. The building was a collaboration not just between hundreds of men at any one time, but between thousands of men across time. Each generation added its own verse to a great stone epic. This slow, organic process, however, was incredibly vulnerable. The chain of knowledge so carefully passed from master to apprentice was fragile. All it took was one major disruption to break it, to silence the hammers for decades, and to lose the thread of the great design. And these disruptions came with terrifying regularity. First, there was the simple, chronic problem of money. Building a cathedral was astronomically expensive. It was the medieval equivalent of a moon mission, a super collider, and a new aircraft carrier program all rolled into one. The funding came from a patchwork of sources: the local bishop's revenues, donations from the king or local nobles, the sale of indulgences, a controversial practice of paying for the remission of sins, and the contributions of ordinary people and guilds. This river of cash could dry up with shocking speed. A king might get distracted by a war and divert his funds. A series of bad harvests could impoverish the region, leaving no surplus for donations. A dispute between the bishop and the town council could halt everything in a fit of political pique. So the work would stop, the great wooden cranes would be dismantled, the mason's lodge would fall silent, the half-finished walls would be capped with thatch or lead sheeting to protect them from the rain, and the site would be abandoned. A generation of skilled craftsmen would drift away, seeking work elsewhere. The master mason might stay on, a lonely custodian of a dormant dream, or he too might be forced to move on. Imagine the psychological toll, to have dedicated 20 years of your life to raising a wall, only to see it sit there, open to the sky for the next 40 years. Weeds would grow in the nave, birds would nest in the triforium, the brilliant fresh-cut stone would weather to a dull grey. It must have felt like a colossal failure, a broken promise to God. Wars were another constant spectre. An advancing army wouldn't politely march around a construction site. The precious lead from the roof might be stripped to make bullets. The scaffolding might be burned for firewood. The town itself might be besieged and sacked, leaving the community that supported the cathedral utterly broken and destitute. A new ruler might have no interest in completing his predecessor's pet project, and so the silence would descend again. But the most devastating interruption of all, the one that tore the heart out of medieval Europe and brought the golden age of cathedral building to a screeching, horrific halt, was the Black Death. When the plague arrived in the mid-14th century, it wasn't just a disruption, it was an apocalypse. It swept through the continent, killing a third, perhaps even half of the entire population. In the context of our cathedral, the effect is almost impossible to comprehend. The construction site, a dense community of workers living in close quarters, would have been a perfect breeding ground for the disease. The master mason might die, his entire team of senior skilled journeymen, the ones who held the crucial knowledge in their heads, might be gone in a matter of weeks. The apprentices, the next generation, dead. The quarrymen, the carpenters, the glaziers, the labourers, all decimated. The institutional memory, the living chain of knowledge passed down from Jean to Pierre, was shattered. Even if a few skilled masons survived, who was left to pay them? The local economy had collapsed. The patrons were dead. The entire social and economic fabric of the world had been torn to shreds. For decades after the first wave of the plague, construction on almost all the great cathedrals simply stopped. At Cologne, the giant crane on the unfinished South Tower became a symbol of the city, sitting there, motionless for 400 years. The dream was not just deferred, it was dead. And when, generations later, communities began to recover, and the work slowly, tentatively resumed, the world was a different place. The mood had changed. The trauma of the plague had left a deep scar on the European psyche. The art and architecture of the post-plague world is often darker, more focused on death, decay, and the suffering of Christ. The confident, optimistic upward surge of the High Gothic period was largely over. When new masons came to the old sites, they sometimes struggled to understand the plans of the old masters. The techniques had been forgotten, the thread was lost. They would look at the complex geometry of the original designs, shake their heads and simplify it, or adapt it to their own newer styles. They did their best to pick up the pieces, to honor the work of the dead, but something essential had been broken. Now let's zoom in from this vast, century-spanning perspective and consider the individual. Let's forget the master mason with his grand vision for a moment and think about an ordinary craftsman, a stone carver. Let's call him Thomas. Thomas is not a great architect. He doesn't know about the complex load-bearing calculations of the main vaults. His world is a 3-foot square block of limestone and a set of chisels. His job for the next 6 months is to carve a single gargoyle that will sit 80 feet up on the north transept, a grotesque figure designed to channel rainwater away from the walls. Does Thomas care that the cathedral won't be finished until the year 1450? Probably not. It's an abstraction, a number with no real meaning. His concerns are more immediate: the quality of the stone he's been given, the sharpness of his tools, the nagging cough he developed last winter, earning enough to feed his family. His world is tangible, tactile. He feels the grittiness of the stone dust under his fingernails. He smells the rain on the limestone. He hears the rhythmic chink, chink, chink of his hammer on his chisel, a sound that fills his days, his years, his entire life. He isn't thinking about anonymous immortality. He's thinking about getting the curve of the demon's wing just right. He's thinking that if he gives the face a particularly comical, ugly sneer, it might amuse his friend who works on the scaffolding crew. He pours all of his skill, all of his focus into this one small piece of the colossal puzzle. He might even carve a small personal mark, his mason's mark on the back of the stone, a place no one will ever see again once it's mortared into place. It's not for fame. It's a simple declaration. I was here. I made this. It's a signature on a single word in a book of 1,000,000 pages. For Thomas, the cathedral is not a distant dream. It is a job, a hard, dangerous, dusty job. But it is also something more. It's the best and only work available for a man of his unique skills. It's a source of immense pride. Standing in the town square on a Sunday, he can point up at the rising walls and tell his children, I helped build that section of the wall, that's my work. He is part of something vast, something permanent, something being built for God himself, and while the grand theological and architectural scheme might be beyond him, the simple, powerful piety of it is not. He is using his God-given talent to build God's house on earth. In a world of fleeting hardship, of disease and hunger and war, this stone reality is the one thing that will endure. The stone he is carving today will outlast him, his children, and their children's children. It will bear witness to centuries of sun and rain, and so he carves. He works through the long, hot days of summer and the miserably cold, damp days of winter. He sees masters come and go. He sees the plans change. He sees work halt for a decade due to lack of funds, and then start again with a new energy. He grows old. His hands become stiff, his eyes less sharp. He teaches his own son the craft, passing on the feel of the chisel, the secrets of the stone, and one day he dies. He is buried in the churchyard, in the shadow of the great, unfinished building that consumed his life. His name is not recorded anywhere. He is forgotten by history. But his gargoyle remains. 80 feet up it crouches, its stone mouth open in a silent scream, still dutifully spitting rainwater away from the walls, just as it was designed to do. For 800 years it has watched the world change below. It has watched plagues and revolutions, kings and peasants, wars and festivals. It has been seen by millions of people, though not a single one of them ever knew the name of the man who carved it. This is the essence of it all. This is the quiet, profound heart of the story. The cathedral is not just a building, it is a monument to collective, anonymous genius. We are obsessed with celebrity, with individual achievement, with making our mark. The men who built these places were, for the most part, utterly devoid of that ambition. They achieved a kind of immortality, but it was a shared one. It was the immortality of the forest, not of the individual tree. The final result of this generational, often interrupted and anonymous process is a building of incredible complexity and richness. They are not perfect, homogeneous creations. They are full of quirks, asymmetries, and odd transitions where one style gives way to another. A pillar on the north side of the nave might have a slightly different capital carving than the one on the south, because they were carved 30 years apart by different teams. A chapel added in the 15th century might sit awkwardly against the clean lines of the 13th century choir. But these imperfections are not flaws. They are the building's story. They are the visible scars of time, the fingerprints of the thousands of different hands that shaped the stone. They built for a future they could not imagine. They couldn't have conceived of our world of electricity, of cars, of the scientific knowledge that would chip away at the very foundations of their worldview. They built for the glory of a God they believed in with an intensity that is hard for us to fathom, and in doing so, they left us the greatest and most enduring artistic legacy of their age. So the next time you have the chance to stand inside one of these great stone giants, let your eyes drift upward. Follow the lines of the pillars as they soar into the vaulted darkness of the ceiling. See the light, fractured into 1,000 jeweled colors, as it pours through a rose window. Feel the profound, echoing silence of the place, a silence that has absorbed the prayers and hopes and sorrows of 30 generations. And think of them. Think of John, the master with the impossible vision. Think of Pierre, who carried that vision forward. Think of Thomas, the carver, laughing to himself as he finished the sneer on his gargoyle. Think of the thousands upon thousands of others whose names are lost to the wind, who lived and died in service to a dream they would never see realized. They are not gone, they are right there with you. Their legacy is in the cool touch of the stone under your hand. Their skill is in the perfect curve of the arch above your head. And their faith, their patience, their incredible stubborn, resilient spirit echoes in the stone. It's a quiet murmur, but if you listen, if you let the silence settle around you, you can still hear it, an immortal, anonymous chorus, singing across the centuries.